What if the war Putin started to prevent NATO expansion actually guaranteed the exact outcome he feared most? The sight of Finnish and Swedish flags flying over NATO headquarters represents one of the most dramatic strategic reversals in modern European history. For decades, Vladimir Putin had articulated a clear red line about Western military expansion toward Russia's borders. Yet his invasion of Ukraine has produced the opposite of what he intended, fundamentally reshaping the security architecture of Northern Europe in ways that may prove irreversible. To understand the magnitude of this strategic miscalculation, you have to step back and examine what Putin's core objectives were when this conflict began. According to multiple reports from European intelligence sources and diplomatic observers, the Kremlin's primary goal was not just territorial control over Ukraine, but a broader rollback of NATO influence in Eastern Europe. Putin had spent years demanding written guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO, that alliance forces would withdraw from Eastern European members, and that the military alliance would return to its 1997 boundaries. These were maximalist demands, designed to restore what Moscow viewed as its rightful sphere of influence. The irony is now impossible to ignore. Instead of weakening NATO, Putin has overseen its most significant expansion since the organization was founded. Finland's membership alone represents a seismic shift in European geopolitics. For the first time in the alliance's history, NATO now shares an 830-mile border directly with Russia. This isn't just a symbolic development, it's a fundamental alteration of the strategic balance that Putin spent his entire presidency trying to prevent. According to European security analysts, Finland's decision to abandon neutrality wasn't made lightly. For over 80 years, Finnish foreign policy had been built around the concept of Finlandization, a careful balance between Western democratic values and acknowledgement of Russian security concerns. This policy served Finland well through the Cold War and into the post-Soviet era. Finnish leaders had repeatedly stated they saw no need to join NATO, viewing their neutrality as a source of strength rather than vulnerability. What changed wasn't just the invasion itself, but the nature of Putin's rhetoric and demands in the months leading up to it. When the Kremlin began demanding that NATO withdraw from Eastern Europe and return to its 1997 boundaries, Finnish officials reportedly realized that neutrality might not protect them from Russian territorial ambitions. If Putin was willing to use military force to reshape Europe's security architecture, Finland's long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity suddenly looked less like wisdom and more like wishful thinking. The timeline of Finland's shift is remarkable for its speed and decisiveness. According to reports from European diplomatic circles, serious discussions about NATO membership began in earnest only after the February invasion. By May, Finnish public opinion had shifted dramatically, with polls showing support for NATO membership jumping from around 30% to over 80% in a matter of months. This wasn't a gradual evolution of strategic thinking. It was a complete reversal driven by the recognition that the security environment had fundamentally changed. Sweden's parallel decision adds another layer to Putin's strategic failure. Unlike Finland, Sweden didn't share a border with Russia, but Swedish officials reportedly concluded that Nordic security was indivisible. If Finland was joining NATO, Sweden's continued neutrality would create an awkward strategic gap in Northern Europe. More importantly, Putin's willingness to use military force against a neutral neighbor convinced Swedish leaders that neutrality itself might be seen as weakness rather than wisdom. The strategic implications extend far beyond symbolism. Military analysts suggest that Finland's membership transforms NATO's ability to defend the Baltic states, long considered the alliance's most vulnerable point. Previously, NATO war planners faced the challenge of defending Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania through the narrow Suwalki gap between Poland and Lithuania. With Finland in the alliance, NATO gains strategic depth and multiple routes for reinforcement. The Baltic Sea, once partially controlled by Russian naval forces, is now effectively a NATO lake. For Putin personally, this represents perhaps the most significant foreign policy failure of his presidency. European intelligence sources suggest that the Kremlin genuinely believed that a quick victory in Ukraine would demonstrate Western weakness and potentially fracture NATO unity. Instead, the invasion has produced unprecedented Western cohesion and the largest expansion of the military alliance since the 1990s. Reports indicate that Putin's inner circle was caught completely off guard by the speed and unanimity of the Nordic response. The economic dimensions of this shift are equally significant. Finland and Sweden bring advanced defense industries, sophisticated military technologies, and strong economies to the alliance. According to European defense analysts, both nations punch above their weight militarily with capabilities that complement existing NATO structures. Finland's experience with hybrid warfare and Sweden's submarine technology represent valuable additions to collective defense capabilities. Perhaps more importantly for the long term, this expansion changes the political dynamics within NATO itself. Finland and Sweden are both stable democracies with strong institutions and clear strategic perspectives. Unlike some newer NATO members who joined primarily for protection against Russian aggression, the Nordic countries are joining from a position of strength, bringing resources and capabilities rather than just vulnerabilities to defend. The psychological impact on other neutral nations cannot be understated. Switzerland, Austria, and Ireland are all reportedly reassessing their traditional neutrality policies in light of the Nordic shift. While none are likely to join NATO immediately, the invasion has shattered the assumption that neutrality provides automatic protection from great power competition. European diplomatic sources suggest that the entire concept of neutrality is being redefined in real time. Putin's failure to prevent NATO expansion has also exposed the limitations of Russian influence in its immediate neighborhood. For decades, Moscow relied on a combination of economic leverage, energy dependency, and implicit military threats to maintain influence over neighboring states. The Nordic response suggests that this toolkit may be less effective than the Kremlin believed, particularly when deployed against established democracies with strong institutions and diversified economies. The speed of this transformation has also highlighted the adaptability of democratic institutions under pressure. Both Finland and Sweden managed to conduct serious national debates about fundamental security policy while maintaining democratic norms and inclusive decision-making processes. The contrast with Putin's increasingly isolated decision-making style could not be more stark. Looking ahead, this expansion creates new strategic realities that will shape European security for generations. NATO now has a direct border with Russia that extends from the Baltic Sea to the Arctic Ocean. This geographical shift fundamentally alters military planning on both sides and creates new responsibilities and opportunities for the alliance. The Arctic, in particular, becomes a much more significant theater for NATO operations and planning. For European Union politics, the Nordic expansion also strengthens transatlantic bonds at a time when some had predicted growing distance between Europe and the United States. Finland and Sweden are both strong supporters of the EU-NATO partnership, and their membership reinforces the interconnection between European and Atlantic security structures. The humanitarian dimension adds another layer of irony to Putin's strategic failure. The invasion that was supposed to demonstrate Russian strength and Western weakness has instead created the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Finland, despite its new NATO membership, continues to provide humanitarian assistance to displaced Ukrainians, demonstrating that military alliance membership doesn't preclude humanitarian leadership. What makes this transformation even more remarkable is that it represents a genuine popular movement rather than elite manipulation. Polling data consistently shows that Nordic populations genuinely shifted their security preferences in response to Putin's actions. This wasn't a case of political leaders dragging reluctant populations into military alliances, but rather of democratic societies collectively reassessing their security needs in light of new threats. The long-term implications for Russia's own security are profound. Putin's invasion has created exactly the strategic encirclement that Russian doctrine has long identified as an existential threat. Instead of creating buffer zones between Russia and NATO, the war has eliminated them. Russia now faces a continuous NATO border from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, with only Belarus serving as a narrow buffer between Russian territory and alliance forces. For the international system more broadly, the Nordic expansion demonstrates both the resilience of the Western alliance system and the continued relevance of military deterrence in European security. Despite predictions that economic interdependence had made military conflict obsolete, Putin's invasion has reminded European leaders that territorial aggression remains a possibility that requires military preparation and alliance cooperation. Whether this represents the final chapter in Putin's effort to roll back Western influence or merely the opening phase of a longer confrontation remains to be seen. What is certain is that the strategic landscape of Northern Europe has been permanently altered, and that the war Putin started to prevent NATO expansion has instead guaranteed the alliance's most significant growth in decades. The question now is whether Moscow can adapt to these new realities or whether Putin's strategic miscalculation will continue to compound as other nations reassess their own security arrangements in an increasingly unstable world.